better view of that than you do. All right. So what I want to hear from you guys, like I said when we ended, I want to hear what happened, if anything, what your experience was with trying out the Lectio Divina, your other reactions to what we were talking about on the last time. We are officially at 4 and counting, so after today we only have 3 left, which rises a certain level of panic probably in your heart as well as mine. So, what about it? How'd it go? What happened? Yes, Anna.
The verses you gave us were very tough for me, especially like the John 15 section. Like I'm sure we've all heard it times, but the part that as the Father has loved me, so I have loved you, abide in my love. And the idea of like abiding in the Father's love and just like sitting in it is very uncomfortable for me. And then like on top of that, the idea from Psalms 65, it said trust Him at all times and pour out your heart before Him. So it's like scary.
Scary, huh?
Hard.
Okay. Other experiences? Yeah.
We practiced Lectio Divina in our stress and science of driving class a couple of times. I think each time it's just been. This class has definitely brought up the concept of how much we are always looking for the right answer. And I feel like that is just, I have been so amazed by that. Like in every situation, I feel like now we're on the other, it's like, it's not the right answer. Like,
Yeah, right. Take a breath. Try to do it different this time. Yeah. Yep. What else? Other experiences or reactions from last time? Well, granted, it is the hardest time of the year to do that. I get that. I understand. But that being said, we've got some more ground to cover. I want to kind of unpack. I showed you the kind of the cycle that we were looking at. We're going to talk some more about it. I'll just put it up here just to remind you. A couple things just logistically coming up. Before Thanksgiving, we were going to try to get the Ragamuffin movie in, and it just didn't work out because of schedule and stuff. So this week we are going to make this happen. It's going to be the 6th at 6 o'clock. It will be in Leprino 104, so it's a smaller classroom rather than big monster one. So there are a few flyers up here. I didn't know how many people would really want it, but just be aware that that's what we're going to be doing on Thursday. It is an opportunity to talk a little bit about the future, and the people that certainly the folks that I've been reading journals from in this class and others, that there is a certain longing, I think, for people that say, well, I wish I could find this kind of community that you're talking about, and it's hard to come by. I think I mentioned to you a quote that the counseling center director, did I tell you this quote? The counseling center director told us at the faculty lunch was, in order to survive here at CCU, either you have to be perfect or a liar. And I hear those words, and I have a double kind of two reactions. One is, yeah, I get that. The other part of it is I get sad because the challenge of doing a class like this is I know that I'm stirring things up, but the problem is you don't have anywhere to take them, other than your own head. As long as things stay in your head, it won't be real, because you have no vested interest in it or investment in it. The minute something comes out of our mouth, we have vested interest in it, partly because we can't really control what goes on after that. And it also means usually that I mean what I say. We have kind of, I think, an innate understanding that our words carry power, and they have power for us as well. That's exactly why counseling exists, is that there's healing in naming things. I had an author once that I show in my grief and loss class, and her name is Rebecca Payton, and her sister was a reporter in Mogadishu during the time of Black Hawk Down and was killed on the streets of Mogadishu. So she kind of does this kind of one-woman show of talking about grief and loss and what it's like to lose somebody and so forth. And the one quote, I think the money quote of what she said in all of the 18 minutes she took to talk was that we disempower that which we speak. The minute and I've said something similar in some of the other, even the workshop that I was talking about it this fall, and that is shame grows in darkness. Therefore, we disempower shame by speaking it. And that's why the Ragamuffin community, what we had called years ago the Ragamuffin Underground was really formed. Was we've got to find some place somehow that it's safe enough for us to speak the things that hold us hostage, because they hold us hostage because they're in our heads, and we don't dare speak them because of somebody else's perspective or conclusions about it. So that being said, that's a backdrop actually to all that we're talking about here. All that we're talking about here, and looking at your spiritual journey. The one thing I want to remind you of as we kind of move farther into this is I would encourage you to listen to my descriptions and listen to what we're talking about in a reflective way, even a descriptive way, rather than a critical way. Okay? Because the tendency is a little bit like what Kaylin said. When I talk about these stages in the journey and so forth, we tend to parse the words and troll the words for what am I supposed to do? And really the reality is that is exactly what is part of our journey, is moving beyond the how do I do it right to how do I do it well? How do I do it engaged and participating in it, rather than looking for a formula? Because I'm still mulling this over. At some point in time, I'm going to sit down and probably just kind of vomit all over the computer screen, because I've been thinking a lot about this idea of objectification, and not objectification in the sense of what we're talking about in human sexuality. A lot of times we talk about it always in the context of even pornography, but it's a bigger issue than you think. Because we even see our spiritual journey as an object to master rather than something to be a part of. And that's the irony is that is an indication of where we are in that journey. And I think that's just part of the deal. It really is I think at some point I don't spend a lot of time thinking through when I talk about this stuff, thinking about where am I? Because it goes back to what I said before when we even started this section of talking about transformational psych, is I am here. That's all I got. And so the rest is all on God's duty, as far as where I go and how I go from there. Because opportunities will come and go, they always will. And sometimes I'll hit them and sometimes I won't. It doesn't mean I failed. It does mean that maybe I missed an opportunity, but that's about all it amounts to. If I turn it into a failure, then I'm not probably going to engage the next opportunity, because I've already, in a sense, determined what I am or who I am. All right? Because when I say I failed, usually that gets translated into I am a failure. So So that's a backdrop to it. We're gonna talk about a variety of these stages, and I'll set it up when we get there. But let me pray to get us going. Father, I invite you into our time. I pray that your Holy Spirit will just continue to open our hearts to what you have for us. Everyone, the really quite amazing part of your presence in our lives is you meet us where we are. And so each person walking away from even today and what's left of the class will each come away with something different, because the remarkable part of how personal you are to meet us just exactly where we need to be met. Probably part of the backdrop to that is that we're not sure we want anybody to meet us there because of how we feel about it. But we bring all that to you. We ask you just breathe a sense of grace into it so that we can leverage that and become part of just or understand your view of us rather than our view of us. In Jesus' name, amen. All right, so I put this up because we're just going to get started. We're going to start and talk about the idea. Back up. The idea of the converted life. There's going to be a portion of these things that I go through that you'll say, yeah, I'm already here. I've done this before. Blah blah blah. The one thing I want to comment on, and again, this I feel a little bit like I'm walking a tightrope, because some of the comments I make about some of these early stages might prompt you to go back and say, oh crap, I did it the wrong way. And I hope that doesn't happen. I can't stop it from happening, obviously, other than naming it. But the point in time where we come to Christ probably says a lot about where we go with Christ. So how we start probably has something to say with where we go from there. And so our conversion, the discovery of God and his activity in our lives through conversion, new birth, the understanding, even the more cognitive phrase of justification by faith. But ultimately, in some sense, for everybody, there is some sense of awe about one major thing, and that's something that we've been talking about through the whole semester, and that is the unmerited favor that is offered us, irregardless of our condition. The thing that we forget is that once we cross that threshold, somehow we think that condition is irrelevant anymore. And that couldn't be farther from the truth. And it goes to the point of what I've said to you guys before, and that is, do we have enough grace to be saved, but do we have enough grace to live? And so where we start in our conversion tends to embed itself in our own psychology. It can't not, because it's a fundamental part of who we are. One of the things that is something just to kind of keep in the back of your mind, and I think we've nailed it enough for you to be kind of foregone in your conclusion about it, is I'm going through this stuff so that you understand the kind of person you are when you come to psychology. And when you do whatever, from here on out, whatever other classes you do, whatever other things you're taught, whatever other kind of projects you do, or whatever else, you're bringing you with you. You can't not. And so you have to have an understanding of the fundamentals of where I started and how I've gone from there. So I think as a general rule, a lot of us have started our converted faith out of a sense of need, maybe even out of a sense of desperation. It probably betrays sometimes why we have gone that direction, and that is the alleviation of the desperation rather than a grasping of what we're actually given. So most of the, depending on denominations and kind of where people come from and so forth, they oftentimes, inadvertently, it is not intentional at all, but they oftentimes mute this new birth and what it actually means in terms of spiritual formation. Unfortunately, and I'll be the first to stand in line and say I'm guilty of this, is we start talking about spiritual formation way too late. Because most of the time we don't understand what spiritual formation means anyway. So generally when somebody comes to faith, what do we give them? This is what you're supposed to do. This is how you're supposed to do it. And out of that come certain life things. So is it any wonder that we end up being formulaic Christians? Because that's how we're started. I mean, when a child is born, we don't give them a manual for living life. We engage them in what? Living. And we teach in the living part, which in a sense is exactly what spiritual formation is meant to do, is to engage us where we are in the journey of our spiritual development and having some ownership in it. My grandson has no idea that he's learning about life. As a matter of fact, it would probably be quite boring for him to consider that. But he is. In terms of talking to people and how you talk to people and why you talk to people that way, it's not so much, when somebody says hi, you don't say, hi. You say something loud enough so they know that they're actually being greeted. Why? Because people are worth treating that way, just like you want to be treated that way. But see, we do that. We don't even think about it with little kids. When it comes to our spiritual journey, somehow we forget about that. Now, I have a clip I want to show you, and the reason I want to show you this is you make the comparison. I'm not going to ask you do it yourself, but you make the comparison to what you're about to see as to what it looks like on your own journey. The backstory is this, and let me ask first, how many of you guys, any of you guys have seen the movie The Mission? Anybody? Nobody has seen it? Okay. Yes? Okay. Isabella, you've seen it too?
Yeah.
Okay. There is a scene in this movie that's probably the one of the more profound scenes, partly because it betrays us. The scene, the backstory is that a slave trader goes and has an argument with his brother, and in a rage kills him. And out of the guilt and depression, he goes to the priest and confesses. And the priest offers him forgiveness, and he says, basically, I'm not worthy of forgiveness. Okay? That shows up in our behavior. So he says, I'm not worthy of forgiveness, and the priest works with him around that issue. Seemingly he's so stubborn, he won't make it any other way. So the priest gets a brainy idea to say, okay, then let's enact what you're doing. So he fills a bag full of the instruments of his oppression of the people that he did the slave trading with. The conquistador uniform he wore, the tools of his trade, essentially, and tied it to his back and gave him the task of scaling a huge waterfall with great peril, a lot of peril throughout it. And what happens at the top is a remarkable point in the movie because of what it meant for him. I want you to keep in the back of your head how much, or if this, I'm not making any conclusions, but if this has any parallels to the things that you tend to do in terms of how you see the things you struggle with throughout life. And then after it's done, we'll watch it, if there's any reactions, and then we'll move on. So here is the clip. it is pretty tough not to be moved, and you didn't have to have the dialogue. What's your reaction? Yeah.
When you were like giving the backstory, and like when I saw the first part of the video, in my head I thought like he was gonna like climb like almost to the top and then like realize that it was dragging him down and cut it off. Mm-hmm. But then I liked how he wasn't he couldn't do it by himself. Mm-hmm. And he needed other people to help him with his baggage.
Yeah.
I thought that was really powerful.
Yeah, the village of people were filled with relatives of the people that he enslaved. And the one person that recognized him was the person who went to free him. What else? Other reactions? Well, I would put it to you that I'm not sure the priest, quite honestly, did him a service, although he knew probably what was going to happen at the top, because you probably haven't seen those three people that young, Liam Neeson and Jeremy Irons and Robert De Niro. But that being said, he had to enact it, which meant it was still within his power to do something so that he could get this. He didn't know that was what was waiting for him, which is really probably why it was such a powerful moment, for sure. But the challenge I have for you is what connects? This is the stuff. Go back and you take any of the verses, the scripture verses I gave you, and apply it within this context, because you have a very, very vivid example of what it is that Hebrews 12 was talking about when it says cutting ourselves loose of everything that entangles us and slows us down. Ironically, at our salvation, we seemingly do that, but then for the rest of our lives, we're picking it up over and over again. And that really is part of this idea. So with the journey where we start, we're flush with all of this kind of effusiveness and excitement. And really, at this point, the individual that we're kind of mythically talking about within the context of this journey becomes the evangelist. They're telling people the very good news that they have experienced. Where they can get stuck is exactly where De Niro's character got stuck, and that is this sense of personal unworthiness and shame, and the lack of, and really they don't know what they don't know, literally, because they're at the beginning of this journey. The progress they make is believing that God has accepted us in Christ, and really we need to be in a community of people that can communicate that to us, not by word. All right? I'd be really careful about this, okay? Not by word. Because words are powerful, but a lot of times in our culture, words are cheap. People, you can say anything. We have disconnected ourselves from the power of words, even though within ourselves, our words are very powerful. And we tend to minimize the impact that it has. But we can get into a spiral of this idea that I'm unworthy and God is called me worthy, but then I'm in this pitched battle because God says I'm worthy, but I don't believe I am. So who wins? Watch your behavior. Watch your behavior. So we can get stuck. And that's exactly why I think the whole message of talking about grace in the context of living life and changing and having the strength to even change is such an important message, because it's true for everybody, no matter where we are in our journey, really, in terms of what exactly does it mean, for example, that God has accepted us in Christ. And I don't want to, when I say mean, I don't mean in a cognitive sense. I know what it theologically means. But the question is, what does it mean for you personally and emotionally yourself? And we seem to always run towards the shame track, because it's like God has accepted me, but I can't, and it's not really that I can't, it's more that I won't, because I don't want to have to continually be facing my need. We get tired of it. And that really is a part of that. So this first stage is one where you're entering into a journey that nobody's laying out a map for you. They really aren't really coming alongside. That's why a community of people is so important that can enact grace. I've learned about grace because of being saved, but I need people to enact it for me, not tell me about it. Remember what I said about objectification, knowing something versus knowing about something. The same thing is true with grace. Is the embodiment of grace is far more powerful than the spoken word of grace. It's important. It's important. I'm not saying it isn't. So stage 2, the convert in this case is grounded in the basics of the faith. Oftentimes in various denominations and other things, that ends up being in a very packaged sort of way. And they oftentimes will be nurtured and guided by either a mentor or a Bible teacher or a pastor. It's not uncommon to see people identify and align with a particular Bible teacher or pastor. And it really is a part of this emphasis that comes along with we lapse into knowing about God, because there's a lot to understand, and that's not bad at this point in the game. It's knowing about God relative to me. It's not just knowing about God. So a lot of the which is funny that A. Andrews, who used to be a president of Navigators, made this comment. He said, canned approaches to spiritual formation have not worked, which to me is kind of ironic, because Navigators seem to be always filled with canned approaches. But what we see even within Scripture is key people with people that are relatively new to the faith that are guiding them and basically doing a commentary on life in light of what's happened in their lives. Naomi and Ruth, you see examples of Ruth having interactions with Boaz and other people, and because she's not part of the Jewish culture, she goes back, running back to her mother-in-law and saying, what do I do? I don't know how to behave. I don't know what to do. Well, that's in a lot of ways, that's what a convert is like. We need people to come alongside and walk the journey with us and do some commentating. What does this mean? How can you engage it? What can I do about it? And you see that in the New Testament with Timothy and Paul, Peter, and John Mark off and on. I mean, Paul was very exasperated with John Mark and sent him away. That was why he and Barnabas split company. And then later he calls for him toward the end of his life to say, have him come. I need to see him. And those kinds of relationships are really quite profound in terms of this stage, if you will, of the learning and disciple life. I'm absorbing things. I have a guided teacher, a guided friend, a mentor, or somebody that helps me to understand life from a different point of view. This is a key point, really, because in a lot of cases, a lot of churches, because of their effort to try to bring somebody along, goes the canned approach route, kind of a didactic approach, a little bit like school, rather than understanding that how we engage the person says something about the journey that they're on. So if we engage just the cognitive process of information and this is what things are and what doctrines you should know and etc., what does that communicate about the journey? The way to navigate the journey is about knowing things rather than engaging things personally. So where we go from there then is the ministry here for this person, and each one of these stages has a description and then a ministry that the person tends to either fall into or be a part of. So they go from being the evangelist of telling good news to being disciple makers. So engaging with other people. The thing that the risk is during this time is to become stuck in legalism, creating formulas for living life. And interestingly enough, you run the risk of imposing that on other people too. So self-righteousness comes in, or a rigidity. Sometimes it can look and feel like we versus them. It can look in a lot of different ways. The progress that they make is in deepening those community relationships that we talked about in stage 1 to actually nurturing soul relationships and understanding kind of where they fit in the body. Spiritual gifts and those sorts of things are a way to communicate that, so that rather than moving from being just the receiver, they can also be contributors. They can also be a part of a bigger picture of also impacting and engaging other people. So stage 2 is the learning and the discipled life. The person moves from being evangelist to disciple maker. There's different points, and keep in mind we're talking about a spiral that can drop down on itself. So can you be at stage 1 and stage 2? Yeah, you can. There's points where those oftentimes cross. And that's just part of how a journey works. It's never it's not straight. It's often setbacks and moving forward at great speed and then getting caught or stuck or whatever. And it's not, this whole journey idea is not new. I mean, if you've ever read, and a lot of people haven't, is The Pilgrim's Progress. That's exactly what John Bunyan was trying to capture in that book. And he did it allegorically, but it really has that same kind of idea to it. So where we get to then is stage 3. This is the productive life. This is where a lot of people are. We roll up our sleeves. We get busy for God. We contribute to God's kingdom. We strive to succeed in vocation and ministry. And ultimately, in some cases, because of the great need, some people are pressured into ministry before they really are ready or mature enough to do so. And I've seen this, having been in leadership in churches for most of my life. I've seen this where we think passion is the same thing as giftedness. Just because somebody's passionate about something doesn't mean they're gifted in it. And so oftentimes we misappropriate their enthusiasm to do something they're not ready to do yet. And in a lot of cases that happens, and inadvertently, when it happens, it contributes to the person's discouragement. And they get discouraged and disillusioned about what? Not about who put them in that job, but about the faith and about God's calling on their life and about a lot of things that go with this. So the emphasis here entirely is horizontal. Success is measured in terms of money and numbers, if you want to put it that way, whether that's money as far as what's happening in the church or numbers in terms of how many people are coming to the church. When I was rubbing shoulders with a fair amount of pastors, the kind of the standing joke was they called it pastor math, because it was always about numbers and money. How big was the offering and how many butts were in the seat. And the exposure of the gospel is great. It is. Nobody's going to debate that point. But the biggest challenge of the new baby church was when they had 3,000 people come to an understanding of Christ and his claim on their lives. That was the biggest challenge of the church. Most of the things you see commented on in early Acts was how are we going to what? Take care of these people. How are we going to help them to grow and to learn about their faith and all that goes with it? And so they had to bring some kind of organization to it. So they had a level, they created a kind of administrative levels almost, where you have the teachers and apostles, and then you have the people that take care of the people called deacons at that point in time. And that was an effort just simply to respond to the needs of people that were coming into the church. And how do we do that? You had lots of people that were disenfranchised, that were marginal people. Go back to what we talked about. They were the anaweem of society, and they're coming into the church. And guess what? They bring their baggage with them. And then the church says, okay, now what do we do with that? How do we deal with this? And so all the very same things that we're talking about today, even in our society today, within the church, homosexuality and sexuality in general, and all of the things that go with that, they were talking about that then. People haven't changed that much. So the issues were very much the same. So in this stage, they seek praise for their accomplishments. They measure their spiritual depth by what they can accomplish for God. And this is the one, and I say this in complete transparency, this is the one I lived at for most of my Christian life. Is I judged my value to God by what I could accomplish for Him. And I held Him to that contract. Because that's what I did. I wrote a contract. I said, if I accomplish all these things, the least you can do is ... fill in the blank. And God has a way of reminding us that He never signed the contract, because He's not held to a contract. He is held by His own volition to a covenant to me. And that we have to engage that differently. So there's a lot that gets embedded in the stage 3 where it ends up, I say that it's about God. The reality is about me. It's about how I can look good, how people can approve of me. And that's a danger for anybody in ministry. It always will be, that we get caught in that. So there's a lot of life and ministry that can be driven by the old self, the things that I feel good about, and that's exactly why so many pastors oftentimes run aground, because they start out with all the best of intentions and all about kind of what we just talked about in terms of sharing the good news and everything else, and before too long we start doing the math and doing the calculations and saying, look at all the wonderful things that God is doing through me, and at that point it's just lip service, because that's what I'm supposed to say. It's more, I'm really saying, look at all the things that I am accomplishing for God. So there's a disconnect with God that usually results in some kind of spiritual dryness, spiritual, disconnectedness. And in a lot of cases, pastors who have been doing it for any length of time hit this crisis point because they feel burned out and in a sense used, quote unquote, by God to accomplish some ends, and nothing seems to be coming back to them. And some of that all hinges on what they expected from God that they never identified that they expected from Him. So stage 3, in a lot of cases, a lot of a lot of churches are at stage 3. But the ministry here is being one of mentor. You have examples here of Elijah and Peter's impulsive leadership, and Demas as a co-worker with Paul. All of these things are examples of these individuals that kind of fell into this place. And the quote I have up here is actually from a pastor that I knew. I am a production-driven person. I hate the ministry practice monster that has mastered me, because not that it has mastered me, it's more a matter of I'm finding a way to keep feeding it, because I get something out of it. And again, it's not where we started. Nobody goes into ministry expecting this to happen. They don't, but it slowly but surely, insidiously, it begins to grow within them, and they don't spend enough time reflecting on what exactly is actually going on here. So the ministry ultimately is one of that, and that's the irony is that ministry is the very thing that becomes for a lot of people a downfall. Because there's a certain pride in being a mentor to somebody else. There's a certain level of status that we gain. And I learned it early because I was a counselor. And in a lot of cases, counselors act as mentors. and it feeds the ego. It does. There's no denying that it does. So as I already mentioned, most American churches are probably stuck at stage 3. That they really can't lead people to some place that they've never visited when we're talking about the stages beyond it. So they view Christian life and ministry in terms of performance, and they tend to burn out and feel unappreciated and resentful and angry. And that's oftentimes what leads to a lot of pastors' downfall, is they feel abandoned by God, and they say, if that's the way this is going to work, I'm tapping out. I will engage in other things that fill my soul, even though I'm not really paying much attention to what's the hole in my soul that I'm not paying attention to. So the progress through this journey is releasing some of these spiritual priorities and values, which seems like would be very counterintuitive. Most of the time what we say is reprioritize the values and priorities. But in this case, to try to get through this stage, if you will, is releasing it and launching onto what I have been talking to you guys all semester about, and that is an intentional journey of the heart. There's no map. I mean, there's a scene in Star Wars in the middle movie, The Empire Strikes Back, and it's a scene of Luke when he visits Yoda on the planet that Yoda was on, exiled to actually. And who does Luke meet there when he goes into that cave? Himself. As what? Darth Vader. That's this same kind of intentional journey that we're talking about here. There are embedded truths, whether Luke has figured it out or not, there are embedded truths in everything, is that the dark side of the very thing we fight against is within us. And fighting that and facing that down is very much a part of that. So where it takes us is the one place where a lot of people, when they hit it, will get so disoriented and so uncertain of where they are that they go back. And that's it's the wall. In stage 3, one of the often experiences this crisis through a life transition. Sometimes people might call it the dark night of the soul. They might call it the internal struggle. They might call it any number of things, but it is so disorienting. It's like entering into a pitch black place. You have no matches and you don't know where up, down, forward, backward is. And for most of us, we talked about this when we were talking about the integration point of view, is what's the greatest enemy of integration? Remember? What's the greatest enemy of integration? Ambiguity. Uncertainty. No clear rules. And that's the wall embodies that. And so you read something like St. John of the Cross's book, Dark Night of the Soul, and what you're seeing is a picture of somebody that literally has hit the wall. And this wall experience is overrun with feelings of abandonment, of loneliness, of isolation, of being unloved. And ultimately, the nature of this crisis betrays and shows the inauthenticity of our journey and how inauthentic it has become, because it's all built on things I can do rather than built on the becoming. And so ultimately our wills come face to face with God, and we are invited to relinquish our egos and our woundedness and our brokenness. I can tell you from having been in this off and on throughout my Christian walk since I started this process, oftentimes I would rather hang on to my woundedness than relinquish those things to a God who loves me. Why? Because a God who loves me is uncontrollable. My woundedness isn't. I know it. It's predictable. And if you've ever heard the phrase, I would much rather have a known dragon than an unknown angel, that's what we're talking about. And the wall has a way of unveiling that. You know, one of the first experiences I had at the place where I take students now for the silent retreat, I was in a wall. I was hitting the wall. I had been in ministry, and everything that I had done, and that's more than likely an overstatement, but it seemed like everything I had done in ministry, whatever I touched, died. It never worked. Nobody was interested. Nobody ever thought it was worthwhile. All of that. And I was pissed. I was pissed. And I was so angry with God because I had knocked myself out, and in some respects even sacrificed my family on the altar of doing good things for God. Hadn't really counted on this level of transparency, huh? And enter one man by the name of Brennan Manning. And Brennan looked into my eyes and said, "Been there, done that." And his first assignment to me was to go to do this silent retreat. And I tell everybody that goes on the silent retreat, I went kicking and screaming. There are probably still heel marks in the parking lot from when I went, because I didn't want anything to do with any of this at all. And I was drug into it. I will be the first to admit that. But over the course of the next 3 days, while all of the disorientation, and there's so much that I identify with the Abrams wrestling match in the dark, because that's where I was, and it revealed all of my self-described importance and all the things that I was doing for God, and He should be so grateful that He has somebody as wonderful as me. And it all crashed down around me. Thankfully, I had the kind of spiritual director that while I was there that wasn't put off by it all, and he just said, "Okay, you got to keep wrestling, and this is how to do this. This is a way to do it. Give it a shot, see what happens." 3 days later, 30 plus pages of journaling later, me and Jesus were still at arm's length. I mean, one of the things I've said to you guys, I know you've heard me say it, is that at no time was I closest to God than when I was wrestling with Him. And that's why I'm not put off by the wrestling match. And the wall is something that we look at and say, I can't tolerate this. Just give me the rules back. Just let me have some semblance of being helpful to people, and everything will be fine. Because at least I know how that world works. I don't like the mystery. I don't want anything to do with it. Leave me the hell alone. And the strange irony is that God loves us enough to take us at our word. It's not his style to crash the door down. So hitting the wall is a really hard part of our spiritual journey. And there's a part of it that has some very long shadows, even when somebody has left it behind. And you want to see evidence of that? Read 1st, 2nd, and 3rd Peter. Because Peter has shadows of that night when he betrayed Jesus in the stuff that he's writing. It's there. You can see it. If you read forth, you will see it. The things that he began to understand about Jesus after his betrayal of Jesus and subsequent restoration of Jesus changed everything about this man. But the shadow's still there. And that oftentimes is the nature of what goes on in the wall. So, examples, Job, Elijah, David, all the psalmists, Peter, I already mentioned. Dante talks about it in his tome, midway along the journey of my life, I awoke to find myself in a dark wood, for I had wandered off from the straight path. The dark wood. And I have no compass, and all I have is just me and God, and that's it. The funny thing about, and again, I know enough of you guys have been in my class, you've heard me say this before, but the funny thing about Job is that when you go to the end of the book, he is commended for wrestling with God. And his friends, who were so wonderfully wise in their pieces of advice to Job, were the ones to say, you didn't represent me accurately. Job did. Which blows up everything about how we engage God. Because we like a God at arm's length. And that's part of why we do that. So the whole idea of hitting the wall, Bob Buford mentions it at halftime. We move from something called productivity to fruitfulness. Not every person who reaches this negotiates its challenges. It gets so uncomfortable that they go back. And this is where soul work begins. So the wall is a work of the heart. It is not for the weak of heart. And that's why we make so many clever ways to avoid it. Because we look at it, which is key. We look at it and say, I don't got it. I don't have the ability to handle this. And the reality is, you're right. You're absolutely right. And the question is, will you still go on? Or are you going to go back because I want something known? Henry Nouwen, in his book, The Inner Voice of Love, talks about it in terms of two different countries. And the old country is the one in which I have grown up and I know and I understand, and the rules and the language and everything, I got it. But I get called to a new country, which is really the entry in a sense is kind of the wall. And I go there and it's so uncomfortable and I'm so uncertain and I don't know how to behave and I don't know what the rules are, and what do? I go running for the old country. And that really is a fitting metaphor of our own journey, I think. Because you're getting called into the work of your heart. And oftentimes, as I said when I started this whole thing, is that we spend so little time there that the reality is we have to return there in order to connect with God again. So hitting the wall is a natural part of this, partly because we start feeling the disillusionment. And the thing that comes along with this is the whole idea of the ministry part is you'll notice something in what we talk about, and I would just cross off the director part. But director, being rightly understood, is really a spiritual companion. I am in no position to tell people how to live life. I am in a position to walk with them through it. So like I already mentioned, some on the journey recycle through stages 2 and 3 and the wall. The people who have passed through their dark night of reorientation are the most free people. And some of that has to do with grasping me. When you hear me talk about self-acceptance in the truest sense of the term, it's from the lessons I learned during this time of my spiritual journey. And again, I just remind you, okay, when you hear me talk about the spiritual journey and how I've engaged in it and what I have been through, please don't turn it into a prescription for yourself. Please don't. Because my journey is my own, yours is yours. The challenge is trusting that journey and embracing the mystery that comes with it. And that's what this is all about. That's why I'm spending all of this time on this particular topic. Because in terms of describing, it's important, but in terms of engaging, it's even more important. How are you going to engage it? Okay? I'll stop there. We'll continue. Any questions or anything? Okay. I'll see you Wednesday. We'll talk more.